Hello, everybody. Welcome to this mini conference, Disability Justice in Emergency Conditions. My name is Joel Michael Reynolds. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy and disability studies at Georgetown University, and I'm so excited to welcome all of you who are watching live right now and all of you who might be watching later on YouTube.
Shalom, happy day after Diwali, Shushti Pavali. Welcome to the Disability Justice in Emergency Conditions Conference, a disability studies cluster event of the fall 2021 semester. I am Jennifer Natalia Fink, Director of the Program in Disability Studies here at Georgetown, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm delighted to welcome you to this crucial and timely event. Joel Michael Reynolds, our host tonight, will be introducing our speakers and panels in a second. But before we start, a few thank yous, invitations, and provocations. First, the thanks. Thank you to my colleagues, the inimitable Libby Rifkin, founder and associate director of disability studies and special advisor for disability to the vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion here at Georgetown, and to Professor Joel Michael Reynolds, who conceived of, designed, and kitten-herded today's event. Watch for his forthcoming brilliant book, The Life Worth Living, Disability, Pain, and Morality, coming in April, yay. I'd also like to thank all of my disability studies colleagues, and especially Sabrina Leeds and Maddie Kay, our fabulous program assistants. Thanks also to, of course, our co-sponsors, the Georgetown Humanities Initiative and the Department of Philosophy, and all those helping to make the Zoom magic happen today. Some brief comments on access. The event today is presented in spoken English with ASL interpretation and Zoom captions. Thanks to our interpreters, Kristen and Stephen. Please make yourself comfortable. Take bio breaks. There will be some breaks baked into the schedule today, but do whatever you need to make this accessible to your particular body mind. All our disability studies events this semester will be hybrid. Wake up. All our disability studies events this semester will be hybrid or on Zoom so that as a community, we can take what we learned about access during the pandemic, which is ongoing, and apply it and not lose those access gains. So what we lack in liveness, conference breadth, and masked knee, we will compensate for in our access, intimacy, and enthusiasm. Our next event in our DS cluster is on November 16th at 7 p.m., Disability and Border Politics with Professor Julie Avril-Minnick of University of Texas, right here on this very same Zoom link. Please also join us for the launch, yay, of the Journal of Philosophy of Disability on November 18th, which is also known as World Philosophy Day. That's at 1 p.m. on November 18th, and Joel will perhaps tell you more about that. Please check us out online. I'm going to put the link in, disabilitystudies.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our fantastic program, including this event series, the Disability Studies Minor, and the new MA PhD certificate. Now, for the provocations. Georgetown University recognizes that the land we currently occupy was and still is the homeland of the Nacatchunk Nation and their descendants, the Piscataway Conoy people. I am actually speaking to you from glamorous Gaithersburg, Maryland, which is Piscataway territory, in the present. I invite you to take a moment, if you haven't done so already, to Google whose land you are on, wherever you are, and you can literally put in the Google, whose land am I on? And it will tell you. I'm gonna wait an awkward, uncomfortable minute for that. And if you want to put in the chat whose land you are on, please feel free to do so. Now you can't unknow it. As I've said many times, I personally kind of hate it when some white lady in, say, a weird hat gets up and makes this kind of virtue signaling proclamation. So let's turn this statement of fact into a call to action, a call to restorative justice for Nacotchunk, Piscataway, and all BIPOC people. I invite you to join me in that work. And if you're looking like, what is that work really, if we're not just virtue signaling here, I've put in the chat some links, and if you have others, please add to the discourse on how we actually do that work. The hard and creative work of making a more just and equitable community here at Georgetown and in the world. And I hope today's conference and discussion with Professor Reynolds and our guests will be one of many reparative steps. Speaking of which, I'm going to now turn things over to Professor Reynolds, who is a professor in disability studies and philosophy here at Georgetown, and also the editor of the soon-to-be-launched Journal of Philosophy and Disability. Professor Reynolds, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for those provocations. Welcome everyone. I know a few of you just jumped in. Welcome to a small virtual mini conference called Disability Justice in Emergency Conditions. Please note that in terms of access, there is live Zoom captioning that you are able to access by hitting the More button, and there will be an option that says View Subtitle. You also will see an option that says Subtitle Settings, where you can alter the size of the text and other features. And of course, we are also having everything ASL interpreted today as well. I'm extremely excited to introduce our first three speakers. To keep things simple, I'm going to introduce each person immediately before they speak. I do want to let all of our audience members know that this is being recorded. We are hoping to place today's events up on YouTube, though that doesn't mean that if you say something during the Q&A, we couldn't cut it out if you asked us to after the fact, but that is our hope and our plan. Our first speaker today is Dr. Sarah Clark Miller. Her talk is entitled Pandemic Precarity in Two Parts, on Disability Justice and Ability. Sarah Clark Miller is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Affiliate Faculty in Bioethics and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Penn State University. She's an ethicist who also works in social and political thought. Her work includes a book from Routledge entitled The Ethics of Need, Agency, Dignity, and Obligation, and articles on sexual violence, relational dignity, reproductive ethics, global responsibility, and harm and moral injury in journals such as the Journal of Social Philosophy and Social Theory and Practice. I'm very excited to kick off today's event with Professor Miller. You may take it away.
Thank you so much, Joel. So I want to share my screen and make sure that is in good shape first. Okay, everyone can see that, yes? Okay, I think we're good. So I'd like to start by providing a description of myself. So I'm a white woman with blue eyes and shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black blazer with a blue collared shirt. I also want to start by expressing my thanks to Joel Michael Reynolds, to Sabrina Leeds, and to the Program in Disability Studies at Georgetown for their organizing labor and for really a tremendous opportunity to be here today with so many remarkable scholars for a crucial and timely conversation. I'm also now going to start my timer so that I stay within the bounds of time. Okay, so this paper considers the plight of two different populations beset by vulnerability and precarity during the COVID-19 pandemic. So first, people with long COVID, and second, healthcare workers who have been on the front lines of response to COVID. In part one of my talk, I'll demonstrate how the frameworks and practices of disability justice can provide a much needed transformation of the response to long COVID. In part two, I'll begin from the concept of debility to consider how the COVID crisis of care has intensified moral injury for healthcare workers, resulting in new forms of damage, which I'll call moral precarity and relational harm. So I want to begin by centering the knowledge of disability justice scholars and activists to bring their expertise to bear on a prevalent form of disability that continues to arise from the emergency conditions of the pandemic, namely long COVID. Leah Lakshmi Piepsa Samarasina, a queer, disabled, non-binary femme writer, educator, and disability transformation justice worker, just how they self-describe, offers multiple fruitful insights in their book, Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. In Care Work, Piepsa Samarasina identifies a model of care that they call, quote, the crash and burn emergency model, end quote, which often occurs within able-bodied QT BIPOC, predominantly white activist communities. Emergency response care webs, these are the type of webs that the crash and burn emergency model generates, arise when an able-bodied person becomes disabled, temporarily or permanently, usually through injury or acute illness. A rapid mobilization of their able-bodied community occurs in response to this crisis. As Piepsa Samarasina characterizes it, quote, there are emails and calls and care calendars set up, and mostly able-bodied people show up to the hospital. Mostly able-bodied people cook food and throw benefits. There's a sense of urgency, purpose, action. OMG, someone is sick. We must come together as a community to help them. Piepsa Samarasina makes two sharp observations about such emergency response care webs. First, when it's their, as they put it, mountain climbing friend who gets hit riding their bike, the able-bodied community cares deeply. But when it's people who are always disabled, care from such able-bodied communities is largely absent. Second, if the person who is injured or ill does not recover and experiences long-term disability, the emergency response care web unravels. And there is a concomitant realization that what seemed like an urgent individual problem is actually one situated squarely in the midst of the institutional barriers and structural injustice of ableism. What Piepsa Samarasina observes in their 2018 book now reads as entirely prescient for COVID-19. Many in the group for whom COVID-19 is slow to recede, that is, the long haulers, have experienced the crash and burn of the emergency COVID care web their communities initially offered, and now also face the ableism of the everyday world. The emergency of COVID-19 is giving rise to the long-term disability of a significant number of those who have been infected. So over a third of people diagnosed with COVID-19, 37%, still experience one or more symptoms such as breathing problems, neurological issues, cognitive impairment, and fatigue, up to 6 months after their diagnosis, according to a September 2021 study from the University of Oxford. The conclusion Piepsa Samarasina draws from their critique is that the crash and burn emergency model of care has, as they write, quote, a lot to learn from disability justice models of centering sustainability, slowness, and building for the long haul, end quote. Taking both Piepsa Samarasina's critique and conclusion to heart, I want to reflect on what disability justice can teach us about how best to respond to long COVID, a response that really has only just begun. Many in the group for whom, oh, wait, sorry, there we go. I got disoriented for a moment. So I turned to the disability justice expertise of Patty Byrne and Sins Invalid, who generated the 10 principles of disability justice, principles that I'm sure are known to many who are with us today. I've listed the 10 principles here for anyone who might not be familiar with them. And longer descriptions of each principle are available through the Sins Invalid website at sinsinvalid.org. So the 10 principles of disability justice are intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, anti-capitalist politics, cross-movement solidarity, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. While all 10 principles contain important insights for long COVID, I'll limit myself to consideration of just 5 today for the purposes of time. Public discussions surrounding long COVID as a disability often focus, at least thus far, on whether long haulers qualify as disabled under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The answer, sometimes, when long COVID substantially limits a major life activity. Another main concern is how disability benefits in the US, which were obviously already quite limited before the pandemic, will sustain the influx of those people who have been disabled by long COVID. Thus far in the US, there have been 46.3 million cases of COVID-19. Of course, that number is still rising. A third of that population, or 15.4 million, are or will become long haulers. While not all of them will experience long-term disability as a result of long COVID, certainly a sizable number will. In light of these developments, I want to heed Piepzza Samarasinha's admonishment to turn to experts on disability, namely those who have been living with disabilities for years, rather than to attempt to reinvent the wheel. The frameworks and practices of disability justice can inform, and I think transform, the response to long COVID. So drawing on the 10 principles of disability justice, we can see that collective liberation, which is termed as a vision that leaves no body-mind behind, and a commitment to cross-disability solidarity, or, and again, to quote the authors of the principles, building a movement that breaks down isolation between people with physical impairments, people who are sick or chronically ill, psych survivors, and people with mental health disability, neurodiverse people. These 2 principles of collective liberation and commitment to cross-disability solidarity should light the way forward. This will involve a recognition that those who were disabled before COVID-19 have similar concerns to those newly disabled with long COVID, and the additional recognition that those who were disabled before experiencing long COVID are often the most seriously affected by the disease. The societal response to long COVID thus needs to prioritize providing support not only for those newly disabled with long COVID, but for all people with disabilities, and needs in general to conceptualize long COVID in relation to other forms of disability. Another of the 10 principles, cross-movement solidarity, reminds us of how essential it is to see connection and calls for solidarity between long haulers and other justice and liberation movements. Any single experience of long COVID will, of course, be situated within a network of relative privilege and oppression, determined by by a certain number of vectors, right? And this is represented in the principle of intersectionality. So, and 2 examples. While weathering long COVID is always difficult, that difficulty increases significantly if one is an impoverished long hauler or an incarcerated long hauler with limited access to material and healthcare resources. And finally, with regard to the specifics of long COVID, the principle of leadership of those most impacted reminds us that we should prioritize the knowledge of long haulers by, and again, quoting Sins Invalid, lifting up, listening to, reading, following, and highlighting the perspective of those who are most impacted, end quote, both by long COVID and by the systems that have made recognition and treatment of this condition very, very difficult. Faced with initial denial that long COVID was a legitimate medical condition, long haulers have been generating knowledge for one another and organizing to disseminate that knowledge for quite some time now. Moreover, this organizing represents and generates a form of what Piepzza Samarasinha calls crip-on-crip support. Okay, so I'll move now to part 2, where I turn to a second example of a population that has experienced a different form of hardship induced by COVID-19, namely frontline healthcare workers. I'll first analyze their circumstances through Jasbir Puar's concept of debility, and then draw in 2 additional concepts to hopefully broaden our understanding of the harms of COVID-19. I'm going to take a sip of water quickly. Okay, so toward debility. In The Right to Maim, 2017 book, Jasbir Puar elevates the concept of debility or debilitation as she says, quote, as distinct from the term disablement, because it foregrounds the slow wearing down of populations instead of the event of becoming disabled, end quote. While I do not want to contend that all aspects of Puar's concept of debility perfectly map on to the experience of COVID-19 frontline healthcare workers, I think there are some notable exceptions, and I can talk about those later. I do think debility can serve as a lens through which we can gain a different understanding of the harms such workers have suffered. More specifically, I want to foreground COVID-19 healthcare workers who have developed PTSD, which can be a form of psychosocial disability. COVID-19 healthcare workers have shown, to cite a recent Texas Tech University Health Science Center study of healthcare workers in Turkey, they've shown a PTSD rate of 49.5% among non-physician healthcare workers and 36% among doctors. Debility, I think, can render such experiences of injury and harm more legible. The seemingly endless press and stress of caring for acutely ill COVID-19 patients has slowly worn down healthcare workers rather than inducing a single event of disability. And very importantly, it is the practice of medicine in the context of late capitalism that has fostered this slow wearing out of healthcare workers, what Lauren Berlant would call slow death, and has, frankly, forced these forms of deterioration upon them. Moreover, as the wearing out of healthcare workers in the COVID crisis of care continues, neoliberalism has begun to render healthcare workers somewhat disposable. So, in light of a concept like debility, I want to explain what I think are some mechanisms of debility. The idea of moral injury is one such mechanism, and it served as a key concept in the healthcare literature for analyzing the experiences of healthcare workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Healthcare providers understand their moral duties to include healing others, meeting their health needs, and preventing or responding to suffering. They can experience moral injury when they bear witness to, fail to prevent, or even sometimes carry out actions that violate their most fundamental professional values. For example, in circumstances of limited medical resources, be those of equipment or time or person power or medicines, doctors and nurses may not have the means to uphold the firmly ingrained principle of beneficence, which entails helping patients or, depending on the circumstances, preventing and limiting harm to them. The crux of moral injury is a dilemma. Doctors know what care patients need, but they are unable to give them that care because of circumstances beyond their control. Moral injury, when experienced repeatedly, induces moral burnout, which is also represented in the concept of clinician distress. Clinician distress is more than a normal kind of burnout. Burnout implies a kind of complicated exhaustion at the individual level that suggests that an individual doctor who is feeling burnt out needs extra support and perhaps a shift in the level of responsibility for the time being. Moral burnout, instead, implicitly recognizes a kind of moral friction arising in interactions between individual levels and organizational or societal levels. Friction with the societal level, I think, is especially important for understanding the experiences of healthcare workers caring for very sick COVID-19 patients, while witnessing societal resistance to measures such as inoculation, masking, and social distancing. So doctors will experience moral burnout when they consistently face a series of double binds that no matter what choice they make, no matter how hard they try, there will be negative outcomes, some of them catastrophic. So in a sense, there is just always a remainder of harm for them, and they're incapable of clearing that remainder of harm. So while moral injury, burnout, and friction, I think, are valuable frameworks, especially for understanding how debility works, I want to turn to two new concepts that I want to introduce to further capture the nature of the harm that healthcare workers have faced during COVID-19. So through the intertwining of the concepts of moral precarity and neoliberalism, we can see how healthcare providers in late-stage capitalism face a seemingly unavoidable violation of their own significant moral beliefs. What is moral precarity? Moral precarity arises in circumstances where fulfilling the moral responsibilities one takes to be central to your sense of identity proves circumstantially impossible without also incurring considerable and unavoidable harm. When experiencing moral precarity, it becomes increasingly difficult and ultimately unfeasible to adhere to the ethical principles that comprise the core of one's integrity. The concept of moral precarity in some ways is an intensification of the notion of moral injury. Practitioners have experienced a marked widening of their perceived circle of responsibility in a context in which two other factors loom large during COVID-19. Their increased vulnerability and dependency resulting from the ways in which they are intertwined with a neoliberal system that governs the realities of healthcare. And second, how their necessary participation in that late capitalist system reduces their ability to fulfill their increasing responsibilities. So I think it's important to reframe the failures of healthcare during COVID-19 as somewhat predictable failures of neoliberalism. The second and final concept I want to introduce before closing is the concept of relational harm, which comes out of my own recent work on relational ethics. In that work, I examine how the COVID-19 crisis of care results not only in individual harms of moral injury, but also in harms to relationships themselves, as I continue to track the impact of moral injury on our intrapersonal, and interpersonal lives. An important facet of the COVID-19 crisis of care is how it operates as a crisis of relationality, in which the intrapersonal and interpersonal connections of healthcare practitioners are placed under tremendous practical and moral strain. So the intrapersonal dimension is one in which relationships, be they moral or emotional relationships that practitioners have with themselves, are put under strain. The interpersonal dimension is a series of relationships, for example, between patient and practitioner, between practitioners and their families, whose suffering under COVID-19, I think, remains largely under-recognized. And the toll of healthcare practitioners playing the role of ferrying and accompanying patients to death, which is a particularly difficult relational role. I want to reflect before closing on this difficult relational role by offering the thoughts of Catherine Ivey, who published a piece in Scientific American from the perspective of a new critical care nurse caring for COVID-19 patients at a medical center in Nashville, Tennessee. Ivey writes, "Every time I tried to describe the COVID unit in anything more than metaphor and illusion, I falter. I can tell you that while for a while, walking into work felt like Dante following Virgil past the gates and the warning inscribed there. I can talk about Charon and the river Styx and how the nurses flitted between worlds, crossing that river of death every time we entered a COVID room," end quote. So in this quote, we can see the very core of relational harm, the toll on an intrapersonal relationship that happens when you're responsible for ferrying people to death, and of course, the toll on interpersonal relationships in the face of the severing that death recognizes or represents. So the final thing I'll say is that in taking a broader view, we can see how the fraying of particular intrapersonal and interpersonal connections of healthcare workers can accumulate, resulting in the unraveling of wider webs of interdependency just when we need them the most. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for that fantastic talk, for kicking us off today. I would like to remind everyone that they can submit questions to any of the speakers at any time in the chat. We're going to do each panel and then do a combined Q&A at the end of each panel. I would also like to remind everyone who just joined that we have live Zoom captioning that you can access by hitting the More button inside of the Zoom application. And we have on the screen ASL interpretation as well. Last but not least, I forgot a very important announcement. The inaugural issue of the Journal of Philosophy of Disability is going to release on November 18th. So please mark your calendars for that. A few of the speakers today, I'm excited to say, have pieces that will be coming out in that journal. So just want to make sure you're aware, and I have dropped a link to the journal down in the chat. Our next speaker is Desiree Valentine. The title of her talk today is Chronic Injustice, racialized disablement, and reparative justice. Desiree Valentine is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Marquette University. Her research lies at the intersection of critical philosophy of race, critical disability theory, and bioethics. You can find her work forthcoming in the Journal of Philosophy of Disability, as well as in Critical Philosophy of Race, the Journal of Public Philosophy, and Puncta, a journal of critical phenomenology. And let's welcome Dr. Valentine.
Thank you. All right, can everyone see the slides? Looks good, okay. So thank you so much to Joel for the invitation, to my fellow panelists, whom I deeply admire and with whom I'm so excited to share this virtual space, to the other speakers, the audience, and everyone at Georgetown who helped organize such a fantastic and timely event. Thank you. The title of my talk today is Chronic Injustice, Racialized Disablement and Reparative Justice, and I will jump right in. So here on my title slide, I have an image of a woman sitting wearing a face mask and holding a Black Lives Matter poster. Following the spring 2020 uprisings for racial justice and the onset of our most recent global pandemic, scholars and activists have referred to COVID-19 and state violence against Black Americans as twin pandemics. While our socio-political landscape allows for conceptualizing these pandemics as separate and thus parallel movements, the processes of racialization and disabilization underpinning both are deeply intertwined. As Ronaldo Walcott writes, quote, "The catastrophe of COVID-19 resides in an already existing state-derived practice of anti-Black racism," end quote. For disabled, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color, COVID-19 did not appear so much as an exceptional crisis as the accumulation and compounding of state-sanctioned violence in the form of ongoing neglect and abandonment in capitalist socioeconomic schemas and healthcare settings. The phenomenon of COVID-19 and state violence against Black individuals is more precisely then a case of mutually reinforcing systems of power. The socio-political systems of racism and ableism are used here to both generate and operate on populations to index their proximity to notions of capitalist productivity, functional normativity, disposability, and premature death. So in this talk, I want to examine how these systems and their concomitant social markers of race and disability intersect to produce chronic injustices that are ongoing, persistent, and ingrained in structures of society. I developed the concept of racialized disablement to bring this to the fore and propose collective response based in structural reparative justice frameworks. I do this in 4 parts. First, I examine how social, political, and environmental chronicities, or ongoing persistent states of harm, are generated. Second, I survey critical disability literature that takes seriously what Rachel Gorman calls the disability-disablement dialectic, which then anticipates the 3rd section where I developed the concept of racialized disablement. Finally, I propose reparative justice as the proper framework to respond to the structural injustices of racialized disablement. So part 1, injustice is chronic. First published in 1920, W.E.B. Du Bois's literary text, Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil, inventories the violences of whiteness, lynching, imperial war, capitalism, and more. Saidiya Hartman, reflecting on this 100 years later in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, writes, and I will quote her here at length, "The influenza pandemic of 1918 does not appear in Du Bois's inventory, perhaps because microbes seem benign when compared with the bloodletting of the Red Summer, or because every year between 1906 and 1920, Black folks in cities experienced a rate of death that equaled the white rate of death at the peak of the pandemic. When the Spanish influenza arrived, they simply died in even greater numbers. But they had been enduring a pandemic for over a decade. Du Bois resisted the impulse to calculate comparative mortality or produce a death table because it was all too obvious. He knew that the facts of Blackness, the statistics, the mathematical equation, and the calculations of probability would not change anything. They had been allowed to die in great numbers without a crisis ever being declared, end quote. So 100 years later, and Du Bois's commitments are unnervingly prescient regarding the condition of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and disabled individuals in the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, there was no crisis declared concerning the chronicities, the persistent states of manufactured harm associated with simply being a Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, or chronically ill person in a society structured by ableist and racist systems of power. Chronicities captures both the disabling effects of dominant social powers on populations deemed disposable, as well as the condition of experiencing such unjust harms and burdens as a constitutive feature of one's lived reality. The existence of chronicities showcases how states of emergency and normality are privileged positions for a select class of individuals, while many live under what we may call chronic injustices. So though the emergency condition of the pandemic was in March 2020 made abundantly clear, almost immediately there were calls from elected officials, economists, and others that we need to quote unquote get back to normal. This was coupled specifically with the awareness that Black, Brown, poor, disabled, incarcerated, and those with chronic conditions and in nursing homes were experiencing transmission, hospitalization, and death at much higher rates. This continued rush to get back to normal is made through the implicit and sometimes explicit acceptance of certain populations being disposable. Indeed, some officials openly promoted the idea that elderly and disabled people were expendable and that their, quote, preventable deaths were preferable to a slowed down economy. Not only this, but populations deemed disposable often then became identified as the locus of or even the culprit for their own deaths. So recall early in the pandemic when posts began circulating on social media suggesting that only 6% of COVID-19 related deaths were from COVID, because the additional 94% of deaths were listed as cases of comorbidity, wherein COVID-19 was listed as one cause of death amongst others, such as pneumonia, diabetes, obesity, and respiratory failure. The push to enumerate the rates by which individuals were affected according to co-emergent conditions was done in order to downplay the effects of the virus and to suggest that it wasn't COVID-19 that caused deaths in these populations, but underlying illness and by extension, already ill populations themselves. The scope of one's moral community is shaped by norms implicit in terms like normal and emergency, which are power-laden and concern societal practices of valuation, care, access, and intervention. The dominant paradigm of emergency signals a state of exception, something that in its catastrophic destruction has reached states outside of the norm of acceptability or sustainability. The dark underside of this, however, is that the abundancy of chronicities facing myriad populations are reinforced as acceptable and even required for the ableist white supremacist status quo to remain. As the Healthcare Access Subcommittee of the COVID-19 Working Group of New York highlights, quote, if anything is normal, it is the very human realities of illness and disability across the lifespan. It is the disabling structures of society that isolate and disregard those among us who are living with them, end quote. Indeed, what has been normal is the persistence of disabling conditions generated by lack of material and social infrastructure, by anti-Black racism and poverty. At base, the persistent and organized extraction from and abandonment of racialized and disabled populations. Opposed to such dominant paradigms of normality and emergency, race and disability justice frameworks illuminate how conditions of normality are actually ongoing conditions of emergency, given the lived realities of many Black, Brown, disabled, and chronically ill Americans. Such experiences are naturalized or made to appear natural and contained in the bodies of individuals when they are anything but. In centering the social and political production of chronicities, we ought to reframe such chronic conditions as chronic injustices. In the next section, I articulate how the ongoing intersecting crises of racial and disability injustice necessitates different ways of understanding race, disability, and their relation. So part 2, the disability disablement dialectic. So historically, disability studies has focused on the recuperation of disability as an identity and as that which to celebrate and take pride in as a community. Critical disability studies scholars complicate both the meaning and experience of disability under ongoing conditions of oppression involving racism, war, impoverishment, exploitation, occupation, and dispossession. Drawing on insights in feminist, queer, and trans theory, critical race studies, and post-colonial, decolonial, and transnational approaches, critical disability theories illuminate and critique the uneven distribution of disability under racial capitalism. Critical disability studies focus primarily on how the disabled subject is produced rather than who the disabled subject is. Now, this does not negate the importance of who the disabled subject is, but resituates our interrogation into the lived reality or lived experience of disability through what Rachel Gorman calls the disability disablement dialectic. For Gorman, focusing on the disability disablement dialectic allows us to make space for the contextualization of disability, holding in tension the representation of disability as identity, status, or state of being, so disability as a noun, with local and global biopolitical processes of disablement, or as Gina B. Kim puts it, quote, the state-sanctioned disablement of racialized and impoverished communities via resource deprivation, end quote. Gorman and others work to uncover the social organization of disability in society, how disability identity circulates, what social relations are revealed or eclipsed via such circulation, and how disablement is produced given such social relations. Similarly, Jasbir Puar focuses on the concept of debilitation, or the slow wearing down of populations, and urges us to ask, quote, what drops out of frame given the racialization of bodies that are expected to endure pain, suffering, and injury? Such reconceptualization of disability aims to move beyond the liberal, often white project of disability inclusion and the erasure of Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people with disabilities. As Kim writes, quote, critical disability methodology is a mode of analysis that urges us to hold racism, illness, and disability together, to see them as antagonists in a shared struggle, and to generate a poetics of survival from that nexus, end quote. I therefore turn next to a discussion of the concept of racialized disablement, which I propose as a necessary heuristic for understanding and laying claim to disability in our present twinned pandemic state. So part 3 on racialized disablement. If disability studies is about the meaning, experience, and cultural constructions of disability that inform and produce contemporary social relations, then there is no disability outside racialized or racializing disability. I propose racialized disablement as a heuristic to help acknowledge this fact, to build in the impulse that race is always already disabilized and disability is always already racialized. To date, and from my ongoing research into the subject, the term racialized disablement in the literature has been engaged with mainly to describe a certain type of disablement, proffering racialized as a modifier for disablement. But if we are to take seriously the co-constituting nature of race and disability, we ought to develop a more expansive and structuring sense of the term. For me, a racialized disablement seeks to denaturalize both race and disability to focus on their political production. Using process-based terms related to both social markers heightens the sense in which neither inhere in particular individual bodies, but rather persist in context of ongoing structural oppressions, materializing populations subject to racialization and disablement. Racialized disablement then helps to identify the production of populations who are targeted by and in which the effects of racism and ableism concentrate. More broadly, racialized disablement is a strategy of reading, accounting for, and making sense of the structuring oppressions that produce racial disparities in health, inequities in civic inclusion, and violent power dynamics in law, policy, and criminal punishment. It works against the narrative of a simple correlation between race and disablement, one that maintains their categorical separation. Instead, racialized disablement is meant to capture how racism and ableism are not past historical or singular events, but are co-constitutive systems of power, historically, politically, and conceptually intertwined. Importantly, I want to express that racialized disablement is not meant to be a new category of enumeration for disabled or racialized subjecthood. Rather, we need to foreground how literal, material, physical experiences come to be, how processes of racialization and disablement materialize bodies that are then categorized, enumerated, and responded to, but also who themselves respond. In this sense, racialized disablement is a term meant to empower one conceptually, a term to both claim and to use to call out, and ultimately, one to invoke hesitation at the impulse to demarcate race and disability as separate, discrete phenomena. As Gorman writes, quote, "Instead of searching for the racialized disabled subject, we must continue the work of uncovering specific genealogies of disability that have been co-constitutive of racialization," end quote. Part 4. By way of conclusion, I position racialized disablement as a heuristic that helps ground claims for reparation. By drawing our attention to the political production of preventable harms, and thus the structurally ingrained wrongs that concentrate in particular bodies, racialized disablement reveals the need not simply for inclusion or equality, which oftentimes amounts to inclusion into the racist capitalist system generating problems in the first place, but it necessitates reparative work to name harm and to adjudicate debt owed. Discussions of reparations often stagnate, however, because opponents argue that the magnitude of harms are too large to compensate, the object of reparation is too difficult to determine, or that the harms occurred too long ago. Much ink has been spilled on these claims, and a rehashing of them lies outside the scope of this talk. But I will say that against standard reparative justice measures, we must shift toward a structural framework that can attend to structurally wrought harms. So standard reparative measures are corrective and individualized in the sense that they aim to return a harmed individual to an original position prior to the harm. But as Margaret Urban Walker describes, this assumes 3 things. 1, that there is some originary moment to which one can be returned. 2, that the repairing body, law, policy, institutions is capable of adjudicating where that point would be. And 3, that the repairing body is itself formed through a moral baseline that can indeed self-correct. In the case of structural injustices, which are ongoing, co-constitutive, and integrated into various institutions in society, this model ultimately fails. A structural framework seeks repair in a manner akin to what Walker describes as a restorative framework, where there is a need to, quote, establish a governing understanding of right relationship and to approach its realization, rather than to intervene episodically to correct deviations from an existing standard, end quote. Racialized disablement helps illuminate how we might reconceptualize this right relationship. The harms of racialized disablement demand reparative justice that includes altering the very structures of society and systems of power that be. Structural frameworks of reparations would likely include collective rather than individual compensatory plans, such as investment in targeted communities and divestment from others, universal income, preferential access to services, and increased political and community participatory power. The realm of healthcare stands out as a key arena for reparative justice and investment in racialized communities, given the connection of slavery, colonialism, and other atrocities to present-day inequities in health. There is increasing interest in thinking critically about opportunities within law to concretely respond to the harms of racialized disablement, though such innovative theorization often remains at the level of diagnosis and conceptual provocation. The difficulty or tension here, of course, is that we are currently required to work within our faulty legal system to craft transformative approaches beyond present doctrinal frameworks. And yet, we cannot let this stall our liberatory envisioning. So take, for example, Kimani Paul Emil's repositioning of the normative commitments of disability law as an analytical lens for addressing structural racism. She describes disability-related law as a better avenue for addressing what is now deemed race-related anti-discrimination law, because it fundamentally reframes race jurisprudence laws in the following ways. For one, unlike race law, which requires plaintiffs to show a defendant's intention to harm or exclude, disability law requires merely the, quote, impact of even neutral actions, policies, and programs, end quote. This directly confronts the ways in which social structures, institutions, and norms can impede a person's ability to live and partake in major life activities. Additionally, Paul Emil notes that disability law provides a better mechanism for allocating remediation costs by requiring an explicitly disability conscious lens when remedies are being devised, thereby prohibiting so-called reverse discrimination. She describes her framework as the Blackness as Disability model and argues that it, quote, shifts responsibility for mitigating the effects of past and ongoing discrimination from the individual disabled by these effects to the collective, end quote. The conceptual shift instigated by racialized disablement for understanding the co-constitution of race and disability and attempts like Paul Emil's to create effective routes towards recompense is in law generates better avenues for reparations for race and disability. Racialized disablement sutures our present twin pandemics and provides the conceptual basis through which to account for state-derived harms. In placing racialized disablement in conversation with structural reparative justice frameworks, we may promote new baselines for moral and legal mechanisms of redress. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Valentine, for that wonderful talk. We are now going to move on to our third speaker of the first panel. Before we do that, I would like to remind everyone that if you look in the chat, we dropped a link to most of the talks and slides, if it would be helpful to follow along that way. The link is to a Google Drive folder where you can find those materials. I also realized I failed to mention another exciting development if you are interested in the topics we're discussing today, which is the release of the book, The Disability Bioethics Reader, which is coming out with Routledge this May. Many of the speakers today are in this volume. It's the very first introduction to the field of bioethics that centers research in and lives of disabled people. And I'll drop a link to a précis of that project in the chat. For those watching after the fact on YouTube, we'll put that link in the information below the video. Our next speaker is Dr. Joseph Stramondo. His talk is entitled Disvaluing, with the parentheses around the disvaluing disabled lives in times of crisis. Dr. Joseph Stramondo is an associate professor of philosophy and the director of the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs at San Diego State University. He is also the co-president of the Society for Disability Studies. Broadly, his teaching and research focus on how social and political forces shape the institutions and practices of biomedicine in morally significant ways. He has published more than 20 scholarly articles and book chapters on topics including informed consent, moral conflict, prenatal diagnosis, organ transplantation, physician aid in dying, and assistive technology. Currently, he is co-authoring a book tentatively entitled Learning How to Look in Bioethics, Race, Gender, Disability, and Sexuality, which is currently under contract with Routledge. And in addition, he has a second book proposal under review, The Ethics of Choosing Disability. We're very excited to hear from Dr. Stramondo today.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Joel. And thank you to everyone in the audience and my co-panelists and so on. I'm very excited to be here. Before I get started, I'll just do a quick visual description of myself. I am a white cis man with a beard and thinning dark hair in a blue t-shirt, and I have dwarfism. I'm going to share my screen so you can all see my. Now I need to figure out how to. There we go. Sorry. All right. So onward. This project really originated with a question that I've been sort of thinking about for a while, and that is the critique that we often see from disabled people, whether they be activists or academics or just generally, everyday folks, that our lives are disvalued somehow. And this critique is often made in the context of engagement with bioethical discourse in various ways. And many times it is just sort of dismissed by bioethical discourse as being too vague or not being substantial. And I think the reason why it is so often dismissed is because when people claim that disabled lives are disvalued by bioethics, they mean different things in different contexts. And what was so interesting to me about the pandemic and sort of all of the ethical questions that were raised by COVID-19 and social response to it is that I think it brought into much sharper relief exactly what is meant by this claim that disabled people are disvalued by mainstream bioethics. And so my talk is focused on this. And so my questions here include what exactly are disabled people talking about when they say that bioethics disvalues us? In what contexts is this claim made? What are the various possible interpretations of this claim? And how has the COVID-19 pandemic and our social response to it illuminated these interpretations? And then finally, I will make a couple of suggestions, but really pose the question of what are the implications of the idea that disabled lives are disvalued, even if we understand that in an interpretation that is sort of the most plausible or the most charitable possible. I think it still is sort of a pretty strong claim. So the various contexts that I think we see this idea of disabled lives being disvalued include end-of-life scenarios, selective abortion, organ transplant prioritization, and then since the beginning of the pandemic, we see it often raised in the context of COVID public health measures, and then specifically also COVID triage protocols. And so I'm going to start off by just quickly laying the groundwork for exactly where these claims pop up and how. So, sorry. In the end of life context, I think that one really poignant example that is described in detail in a Hastings Center report paper by William Peace, which is just sort of like a reflection of his own experience in the hospital. He talks about how when he was hospitalized for a bed sore, he had this experience where a physician who didn't know him and didn't know anything about him came into his room in the dead of night when nobody else was around to try to persuade him to sign a DNR order. And so I'll just sort of read an excerpt from that piece to sort of give you a sense of how that relates to this claim of disvaluing disabled lives. But the underlying emotion I felt during my long and arduous recovery was fear. My fear was based on the knowledge that my existence as a person with a disability was not valued. Many people, the physician I met that fateful night included, assume that disability is a fate worse than death. Paralysis does not merely prevent someone from walking, but robs a person of his or her dignity. In a visceral and potentially lethal way, that night made me realize I was not a human being, but rather a tragic figure. Out of the kindness of the physician's heart, I was being given a chance to end my life. Now, I also want, since this is specifically a disability justice themed mini conference, I want to incorporate an analysis of how this same phenomenon of disvaluing disabled lives intersects with race and poverty and other kinds of overlapping oppressions that sort of amplify this tendency to disvalue the lives of disabled folks. And so to do that, I have a picture here of Michael Hickson. I don't know if folks are familiar with this case, but if you're not, I would urge you to Google it. He was a man who was living in a nursing home that has quadriplegia and a brain injury. And he contracted the coronavirus. And basically, once he became critically ill, his physician withheld care so that he would die, with the justification that he didn't have a good enough quality of life to justify treatment with a ventilator and ICU bed and so on and so forth. And his spouse actually had a iPhone or some kind of smartphone recording going as she was talking to the physician, and recorded the physician sort of telling her this, that his quality of life was not sufficient to justify treatment. And so this is another example of disvaluing disabled lives in the context of end-of-life scenarios. Another scenario in which this happens, or context, is prenatal diagnosis and selective abortion. Deborah Kent has a chapter in this sort of groundbreaking book edited by Eric Perrins and Adrian Ash that really brought these issues of prenatal testing and disability into the bioethical discourse about a couple decades ago now, I guess. And here she talks about the response that her parents and husband had to the knowledge that her baby would not be blind. And she talks about just a quick quote. I wanted our child to be welcomed without reservation, wanted Dick to see its birth to greet its birth with joy. I did not know if I could bear his devastation if our baby turned out to be blind like me. And so I think this captures the experience that a lot of folks with disabilities have in sort of the context of reproduction and the discourse around reproduction, that there is this sort of disvaluing of life with a disability. Next, we have organ transplantation. I'm not going to read this entire quote here, but suffice to say that there are both systemic and more individual attitudinal barriers to disabled people being on the receiving end of organs when they need them, because of so-called quality of life judgments that are made about it sort of not being efficient enough to give scarce resources like kidneys or hearts to disabled people who would not have an adequate quality of life in order to justify the expenditure of that kind of resource. And so there's a whole report by the National Council on Disability about organ transplant discrimination and disability that came out in 2019 that is very illuminating as far as some of that goes. Finally, to get into sort of the COVID analysis, the point of this talk, there are two instances, I think, in which the idea that disabled lives are disvalued really was highlighted by or illuminated by the experiences of the pandemic. In the first case, and something we've heard about already a little bit, we have sort of the social response to the pandemic and the idea that some of us were more vulnerable than others to critical illness and death. And so Elliot Kukla wrote a really powerful op-ed early in the pandemic in March of 2020, talking about how they were getting the message sort of over and over again that it was too inconvenient, pretty much, to do what was needed in order to protect disabled people like them from this pandemic and this disease. And so I'm not going to read this whole quote. It's available in the Google Drive, but I'll read part of it here. The way to save our lives is clear, according to public health experts. If you possibly can, stay home, especially since we are surrounded by people who don't have that option, including migrant workers, unhoused, incarcerated, and institutionalized people, and healthcare workers. And yet young, healthy, affluent people are still taking advantage of cheap airplane tickets and using their time off to go to restaurants while they remain open. And so this is then framed as sort of an acceptable loss, right, as a disvaluing of disabled lives. And notice the intersectional analysis here that Kukla is offering, and that I think we heard from some of our other speakers that already have talked a bit today. And in that it's not just disability that is being disvalued, but especially disabled people who are not white and who are poor, and so on and so on. And then finally, we have sort of the crisis standards of care. And this is something that I've written about a bit as well in other contexts. But we had at least two kinds of disvaluation of disability in crisis standards of care. One was in the context of categorical exclusions, where there were some crisis standards of care or triage protocols that basically said, if you have this disability diagnosis, then you're just sort of automatically going to be excluded from critical care, like a ventilator. And then secondly, there were others that were a little bit more subtle, including the University of Washington's critical crisis standards of care that spurned a lawsuit. And in this one, they basically said, well, we're going to look at a quality of life judgment and say, even if this person survives with the administration of critical care, how will their quality of life be afterwards? And this, of course, deprioritizes disabled people, because many times quality of life is just code for non-disabled life. So in all of these contexts, I think that it's not always clear exactly what is being claimed. There's different ways to interpret this idea of disvalue, okay? And so I'm going to try to quickly work through these four possible interpretations. The first is the idea that disability is a fate worse than death. And I think this is what Bill Peace was talking about when he wrote his piece in the Hastings Center report, right? He was highlighting how this hospitalist was claiming that, in his case at least, continued life with a disability would actually be worse than death. because it is of such little value. And I think this is a common belief that many disabled people have been told. I've actually had this told to me that, even if I were you, I would kill myself kind of narrative, right? By perfect strangers. And so this sort of rings true to many disabled people, that there is this common belief that disability is a fate worse than death. Riva Lair's great memoir, Golem Girl, describes one situation in which she was a young professional trying to buy her first suit for a job interview. And this person in the department store comes up to her out of the blue and says, if I were you, I would kill myself. And so this is one interpretation of what disabled people mean when they say that bioethics disvalues their lives, right? But I think that this is somewhat of a straw person, right? Because it's kind of obviously false as a generalization that all disability is worse than death. I don't think most people believe that. And I don't think it's plausibly applied to all instances of disvaluation of disability in bioethics. I think that there are ways to disvalue disability without adopting the belief that disability is worse than death. And we can see that with things like cochlear implants, vosoritide, which is a drug that shuts off the gene for achondroplastic dwarfism, or even something like the polio vaccine. It disvalues disability, right? But it isn't justified with the belief that it's worse than death. Then there's the second possible interpretation that it's worse than non-existence, right? And I think this is what we see a lot of times with the claim of selective abortion, right? That by what's sometimes called the expressivist argument, that we say that, well, this means that disabled people are better off just never having existed, right? Not necessarily better off than dying, but better off just not having existed, right? And this raises what philosophers sometimes call the non-identity problem, which I'm not going to get into. It's really complicated, but suffice to say, it's really impossible to evaluate this claim from a first-person perspective, right? Because nobody that I know of can sort of say much about what non-existence is actually like, and whether anything is better or worse than non-existence, right? And so we have this sort of epistemic problem with this claim. And so I think that it's not really a very plausible way of thinking about the idea that disabled lives are disvalued in bioethics. Now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to very quickly sort of say there's this idea of disabled people not being worth the effort, right? And I think this is a lot of what Kukla was getting at in that New York Times piece, right? This interpretation of the disvaluation of disability basically says that, your lives might have some value, but they're not enough value to be worth the effort to preserve them, right? And I think that this one is commonly believed, but I don't want to dismiss it too quickly because it really depends on context, right? There are some situations in which it's obviously a horrible thing to say, right? That disabled lives are not worth the effort, like when the balance or the utilitarian calculus is just something simple like wearing a mask that would protect others around you. But I think that sometimes there are other contexts in which we have to take this claim a little bit more seriously. I think that balancing losing livelihood against the risk of death to others is a serious issue, right? And so if you have sort of this kind of intersectional disability justice analysis, you're going to look at this in terms of, well, sheltering in place would have been a great way to, stop the pandemic in its tracks. but it really wasn't an option for many poorer folks that had to get to work every day in order to feed their families. And so, you can try to mitigate the risk as much as we can, but there is some credibility, I think, to the idea that you're balancing different interests in sort of an imperfect context of oppression, right? Where folks would either starve or go to their minimum wage job and risk spreading the virus. That's something we need to take seriously. And then finally, you can also talk about the not worth the effort critique in terms of caregiving, and the idea that we do have to take seriously the idea that balancing long-term intense caregiving responsibilities without adequate support is a serious effort, and maybe it's plausible to say that in some contexts it's not sort of so-called worth the effort if the other option might be the termination of a pregnancy. Now, with all of these, though, we have to talk about how oppressive structures distort all of these calculations to a greater or a lesser degree. And so it's not always that someone is wrong when they decide that another is not worth the effort in their sort of individualized case, right? But it's also pretty horrible that they're even put in that position because of these oppressive structures. And then lastly, if you'll indulge me, I know I'm a little bit past time here. I think I might have started a few minutes late. There is this comparative badness. And I think this is where we really see how the triage protocols illuminated what we're talking about here with disvaluing disability, right? This is probably the most widely accepted interpretation that many people believe, even many disabled people believe this in some contexts, right? That life with a disability can be comparatively bad to life without a disability, okay? And I think that it motivates the development and even celebration of normalizing and curative technologies. This idea that, oh, we found, this cure for achondroplasia or something, right? Or we found the cure for deafness with the cochlear implant and so on and so forth. This is made on the presumption that, not that life being, a little person and life being deaf is somehow, worse than death or something, right? But nevertheless, it's a disvaluation, a comparative bad, that being a little person or being deaf is somehow worse than being average height or being hearing. And so this, I think, is what we saw with the COVID-19 protocols, right? Because being forced into a comparison of the value of disabled and non-disabled life by conditions of scarcity, that physicians and hospitals were asked to think about the impact that disability makes comparatively to quality of life. Okay, but what I want to highlight is that it's actually false that we can say that this is generally true, and that's much too sort of ham-fisted to sort of make that claim that all disability is always bad, or even most of the time bad comparatively to non-disability, and it doesn't recognize sort of the actual experiences of many disabled people. And it's something that, due to what we call epistemic opacity, we can't even make a judgment about, right? I have no idea what my life would have been like without my multiple disabilities, right? You can't sort of make a comparative judgment between the life of disabled Joe and non-disabled Joe, right? And so without being able to do that, you really can't say whether or not it's a comparative harm to be disabled. So that's pretty much my my talk. There's a little bit more sort of unpacking the comparative badness and of disability. and why I think that has some pretty bad implications, even if it's a weaker claim than something like disability being worse than death. But we can hopefully get to some of that in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that fantastic talk, Dr. Stramondo. We're now near the conclusion of the first panel, and we're going to be taking questions. Let me get everyone up on the, or 3 speakers up on the screen here, or spotlighted. So if you have a question, you can raise your virtual hand. It will be a little hard if you raise your actual hand, but I'll keep an eye out for that. And you can place questions into the chat. Currently, we have one question from Sean for Joe. Sean, let me put you up on the screen.
Hi, Joe. So really interesting talk, and I think a useful taxonomy of different ways that disabled lives might be and are often devalued. I guess I'm just trying to sort of drill down on the prepositions relating the devaluing of disabled lives and bioethics. So, you know, it's often said by some of the people, including by some of the people in this sort of virtual room, that disabled lives are devalued by bioethics. And I don't recall whether you used the preposition by, but that sort of suggests that that's kind of the view of bioethics as a field, is that disabled lives are less valuable. And, you know, that may have been true when it was said in bioethics in the 90s or something. But, you know, since I've been trained in bioethics, all of these things have been described as a matter of open debate, right? In such clearly mainstream bioethics institutions as like the National Institutes of Health, right? So it strikes me as more accurate to say, or at least more easily argued, more demonstrable to say that disabled lives are disvalued in bioethics, that is by some bioethicists, as opposed to by bioethics, right? That requires at least there's another burden of argument to sort of attribute a view to bioethics as a field, as opposed to just point out that certain people in the field have that view.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's true, that it's a view that's present in bioethics rather than by bioethics. And I think another reason to avoid the language of by bioethics is that it somehow might be interpreted as being exclusive to bioethics, which it's not, right? I think that you know, especially the last interpretation here of you know, disability being devalued as a comparative harm, I think is a widely held belief that's, you know, far beyond just bioethics, right? So I mean, I think that's another, you know, an additional reason to sort of talk about it in those terms. But I do think that it is sort of the dominant or most prevalent view about disability, not just in bioethics, but just in general, that it is a comparative bad, right? In that, you know, maybe we can sort of say, well, of course, not everybody thinks that disability is, you know, a fate worse than death or something, right? And that's kind of the point of my talk, right? That if you just sort of say, well, look at how much, you know, progress bioethics has made in the past 2 decades. You know, people aren't saying anymore that disability is a fate worse than death. You know, that's, you know, a view that no one in the mainstream really defends. Okay, but I do think it's right to say that the view of bioethics is that, you know, as a whole, mainstream bioethics is that disability is a comparative harm. I think that still is, you know, a widely held belief. And I guess I think that particular interpretation would be defensible to sort of say that it is the view of bioethics and not just in bioethics. But I would also follow up by saying it's the view of lots of people outside of bioethics as well.
We've got a question from Eva Kate for Sarah.
Thank you all speakers for wonderful and illuminating and important papers. Sarah, I loved your paper, and I think you've hit upon such incredibly important issues within moral theory and within our moral lives. There's one point that you kept stressing, using some of the literature, that those most affected should lead, and I think there's something so right about that, but there's also something so problematic about that, because those most effective are often the ones with the least resources in terms of time, energy, when you're talking about disablement, either through disability or through long COVID, or if you're talking about the long-term care health workers and nurses and doctors. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how to resolving that difficulty, that problematic.
Thank you, Eva. And I will say, one never gets over the fear of presenting one's work in front of one's dissertation director. So that lasts a lifetime. So I'm glad that you thought the paper was decent. That is nice to hear. So I think that, so when I talked about the notion of the most affected should lead, there was a change in scope for that moment, just to note this to start. So at that moment, I was talking about conversations regarding long COVID itself, right? So I think that in broader disability justice discussions, those who are newly long COVID people are not necessarily the ones who will lead, right? So they don't have special claim on the microphone just because they have entered, just because they're a long hauler. So I just want to clarify that. Mm-hmm. So right, those who are most affected are also in many ways often most taxed. I think what's particularly productive about the disability justice framework and these 10 principles from Sins Invalid that I was working with today is that the principles work together, right? And so if some of the other principles are functioning well, there should start to be, one hopes, structural change that relieves some of the burden on those who are most affected, right? So the sense of those being most effective, being called to lead, does not necessarily, leading can happen in a number of different ways, right? And I think it's definitely a model that focuses on leading as able. And I think importantly, to emphasize perhaps Sabrina's point, the leading is often important for CRIP to CRIP support, right? And so this is not necessarily leading that's going to happen external to communities where you are building forms of interdependence that are sustainable. So I think that the problem you're pointing to is very correct. I think what is promising to me within the 10 disability justice principles is that I think there are other ways of mitigating the difficulties of being most affected, such that additional space for leading could be created.
Thank you.
So I'm going to jump in with a question. This is really for anyone, but perhaps most specifically for Desiree. I think this might actually get back to part of what's at stake in Sean's concern. I often have trouble when I'm teaching these materials or talking about these topics with my students to cleanly distinguish between debility in the sense of causing impairments in a way that we think is unjust, versus talking about any number of sets of impairments as not comparatively bad. And it seems to me that part of what's going on in that tension has to do with a causal chain, that in the case of the concept of debility, there's an explicit link between what is causing those forms of impairment, namely that they are unjustly caused through some set of means. Whereas when we make generalized claims about impairment as such, we're not necessarily looking at what caused them. but I'm not sure that's actually the only thing going on there, the best way to think about that. So I would love any and all thoughts on how to think about that.
Sure, I'll jump in. Thank you, Joel. This is always something that's at the forefront, I think, of thinking through these issues in an intersectional manner, in a like nuanced and complex way. And it's important, I think, to recognize the points of solidarity that are generated from a structural analysis. So I think we have to center the fact that what is the injustices that are being generated for large swaths of individuals, however disability arises, is because of structural injustices, whether that's based in, economic systems, processes of racialization, impoverishment, et cetera. And that so the possibilities for solidarity to think, between and across debilitation, disability, et cetera, come from the fact that living in a racist, ableist, capitalist society, we're faced with certain injustices that are compounded and accumulated, again, almost regardless of how disability arises. So centering that structural critique is important to me, at least. And I think that allows for the space to capture, various distinctions regarding disability as an identity, disablement, debilitation, et cetera. And like you too, I think I'm constantly looking for ways to articulate that. And I'll just point to one piece that I recently read, and it's Alison Kafer's, I think it's After Crip, Crip Afters, which is this, I think, really beautiful meditation on that involves some of those questions that you're bringing up. So I would suggest that to anyone who's interested.
I think another response to that concern, Joel, is illuminated by Barnes's paper, Valuing Disability, Causing Disability. In that, I think this is exactly the question she was sort of trying to tackle here, right? Can we say that it's not bad to be disabled, but it is bad to become disabled? And I think, I'm not sure, if it's the only, plausible response, but I found it pretty compelling. She points to transition costs, right? If I were to sort of suddenly wake up tomorrow morning and I was 6 feet tall, that would be bad for me, right? Not because it's bad to be 6 feet tall, but because there would be this huge transition cost, right? And so you can sort of talk about debility as being sort of bad for someone without necessarily talking about disability being bad for someone. And so I think that's another response. And then another thing that occurred to me in addition to that, and I'm just sort of, I'm not sure if I can state this clearly, is the idea that I don't think it's always wrong that disability is comparatively bad for someone, right? I think that it's not always true, and that's what I'm sort of pushing back against, right? This generalized belief that disability is comparatively bad, right? But I don't think it's always untrue either, because of transition costs and because of all sorts of things. It could be because of injustices and so I think that we just need to look at these questions with more nuance and not make sort of sweeping claims in either direction, in order to think clearly about it.
And in addition to that piece by Elizabeth Barnes called Valuing Disability, Causing Disability, if I remember correctly, Joe, your piece with Stephen Campbell, The Complicated Relationship of Disability and Well-Being, that came out in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal. I think I remember you both arguing that, yeah, in the case of chronic pain conditions in particular, those are probably comparatively bad. I remember that caveat there. So I appreciate you bringing that nuance to the table. So we We have a question from April and a follow-up from Eva, but I want to be very careful that we leave time for lunch, selfishly because I'm starving, and also just as a general principle. What's going to happen is this entire event today is, it's the same link. So you can leave and then re-click it and everything will still be here. We are going to stop the recording now for our YouTubers who will be watching this in posterity, and we'll see you back at the next panel.